Hi, this is Natu, a guy who's way too old and way too long involved in this game, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.
Counter-Strike was the world's first true grassroots esport. Now, the distinction as to why I can say that, because people might know I originally come from the Quake community. I was playing and watching Quake years before any version of Counter-Strike existed. Counter-Strike first came along as a mod in 1999 in the summer. And the reason why I make this distinction that it's the first true grassroots esport is because Quake wasn't a grassroots esport in as much as there was no esports back then. It was just Quake. What happened was there was a game called Quake. It was one of the first massively multiplayer, because you could have 16 players. You could play it over TCP IP. You didn't have to play it on a local area network or dial up with a modem to a particular server. And therefore, Quake had a lot of passion and enthusiasm behind it, and that's why it had what initially became the foundations of the esports industry, was just people putting on Quake tournaments, making Quake leagues, etc. But as a result, it was mainly just Quake, and actually those people were so passionate about Quake and so into Quake, they would have made some of these leagues and tournaments even if it hadn't have been a big game. And comparative to how many copies of Quake were sold and were played for single player purposes, not that many people converted over and became multiplayer online players, and especially not in the competitive scene in what later became termed as esports when we expanded it out to have multiple games rather than just Quake. So the distinction here is that what makes Counter-Strike the world's first grassroots esport is that it is an esports game full stop. Like, it's a multiplayer game. There's no single player mode. It's a game that in some senses, in the esports context, forced its way into the scene. There was an industry there built around doing games in Quake and in StarCraft Brood War, and along came Counter-Strike, and it was such a success on a grassroots level of people who just played the game and then made up a big community and then showed there was interest and then supported the early tournaments, that it actually managed to dislodge, like almost like a cuckoo effect, where it came into the nest of another bird, threw out its eggs, Quake, StarCraft, inserted the Counter-Strike ones, and that blossomed and became actually a massive esport for over a decade, still continues in terms of legacy, and obviously with its successor CSGO into the modern day, and is still alive now 18, 19 years after the first mod came out. So Counter-Strike was the mainstay esports game of European esports from 2001 onwards as a premier title up until it died off around 2012 when CS 1.6 was killed off. And then it only had an absence, even then, of about the first 12 to 15 months of CSGO. CSGO came out around August of 2012, and it wasn't really until we got the first ever major DreamHack Winter 2013, so in November of 2013, that we had a true Tier 1 esports event for CSGO, and finally it started to make its inroads, especially over the next year and a half, to becoming a full-fledged premier esport. It probably at that point in time established itself back as a number 3 or number 4, and over the years it's made its run up to, at times, contending for number 1. If you include just Western esports and not China and Korea, where they have different numbers, then yes, it's certainly been a contender for number 1 the last couple of years. Now, the reason why this is significant is because you had a number of other esports games around, and you've had a number of big esports games since that went to number 1. I actually talked about some of this in my mods video. The problem is, many of the other esports game in that time span of CS 1.6, so the 2000s into the early 2010s, were games that had an artificial nature to them. So just as I said before, Quake would have had a scene and would have had a very similar scene, even if it had half as many players, because it was just about passion for the game of Quake. Well, in a similar sense, a lot of esports games along the way were picked for artificial reasons. Tournament developer, a game developer was willing to pay some of the money, therefore you'd include their tournament. A certain region was more popular around this one game, might have been Dota, might have been StarCraft, might have been Warcraft 3, that you included that tournament in your circuit when you went to those stops. The difference is Counter-Strike forced its way in, was so popular that you had to feature it. It became the number 1 cash earner, so people switched in the West to running Counter-Strike tournaments, even if formerly their whole infrastructure and entire mission had been to feature Quake, because that was the game that initially excited, inspired the ESLs of the world, CPLs of the world. Instead, it became all about Counter-Strike. Then you've got to add in, sure, Quake was a very popular game, but that's just as a game. And that was from single player sales, where everyone bought it because it was the sequel to Doom and Doom 2, and everyone wanted to play this sick first person shooter that had fully 3D graphics, and this seemed like an amazing thing at the time. it wasn't from multiplayer aspects. It definitely wasn't from esports and competitive components. That was a very, very, very small niche of a niche of the people who even played multiplayer. And a lot of people remember back then didn't have the internet. If they did have the internet, they didn't play games on it because the ping was so bad, and you didn't have anywhere close to the competitive community that we have now. Then you've got to add in that when Quake came out, as I said, there wasn't esports and there wasn't very much competition, quite frankly. Quake came out, and what was the competition? It was stuff like Doom, it was stuff like later on Jedi Knight, etc., and Unreal and Duke Nukem 3D. Many of these games came out after Quake, copied Quake, were attempting to be Quake killers in terms of games like Unreal, and so there wasn't much competition for Quake early on. It was just Quake. It had also pioneered a lot of the technology, like TCP/IP, ability to play. Then, as I say, they put on these tournaments around it because they were into Quake, because they played Quake, because their friends played Quake. A lot of them were actually, in the early days, programmers or people who had a lot of technological knowledge or could get the ability to hire a small space to hold a LAN party or to hold a tournament or get a sponsor regionally to put up some money to do that. It wasn't due to any special impetus like, wow, there's so many people playing Quake that we got to make tournaments for it. We've got to do all this. That was the case for Counter-Strike. Remember, Counter-Strike came out. It was just a mod. It was like one of many mods, Day of Defeat, Natural Selection. You've seen many, many mods since, Dota, etc. All these mods come along. Counter-Strike was just a mod. People were just supposed to play it if they wanted to. They had to download it. They had to hear about it from someone. They had to find a server to play it on. They had to figure out what the fuck was going on with it. It came out in June 1999. And a retail version that you could buy on a CD didn't come out until November of 2000. And by then, we already had a scene around it in Europe. We already had even CPL events around it. And the next year was when it would become the main game of the CPL. So it forced its way in, not just to the collective consciousness of gamers generally, multiplayer online gamers. Every Quake player, even if they didn't like Counter-Strike, heard about Counter-Strike, saw people at LANs increasingly playing Counter-Strike over games like Quake. But it came into the competitive scene in a similar amazing fashion due to this massive grassroots upswell of sheer number of players playing it and interested in it as a game. And so, in fact, how it got into, at the time, the premier esports tournament was the CPL, the Cyber Athlete Professional League, which was run out of Dallas, Texas, and had numerous tournaments in Quake in the late 90s. And initially, Quake 3, 1999, 2000 was its main game. That was the main game. Quake 1v1, it was trying to make the esports worldwide, global, a massive thing with Quake 1v1. That was the game that they thought they was going to do it. But then along came Counter-Strike, and what initially happened was, since the CPL also had a BYOC component, bring your own computer, which is part of how they funded CPLs, you'd pay like, I think like a few $100s to go and rent a space, and you'd bring your own computer, you'd play there, and then they'd have some tournaments which you also had to pay to enter. And so what happened was, within the BYOC, even though these were Quake tournaments in terms of the esports side of the CPL, already in 2000, in 1999, you were having Counter-Strike tournaments take place within the BYOC. People wanted to play that. The Counter-Strike players from Texas came along. Famously, that's where a lot of the initial teams actually were based. The Riot Squads of the world, Syndicate, some of the guys out of CK3, obviously PAG, Plano as Asian Gang, Tau. We had all these early teams. Green Berets even had some players from there. They all came along, DOP. They would all come along, they would all play there, they'd play a little tournament. It wouldn't be an official tournament, it wasn't even a proper esports tournament, it was just a little LAN. They'd play it, but year on year, it got bigger and bigger, and then Counter-Strike as a game got bigger, and eventually, by the time you got to 2001, CPL was ready to transition and pivot completely away from Quake, even though that was the number one game at the time, to Counter-Strike, and from then on, the rest is history, as they say. It took over from Quake 3 as the big game. By the end of 2001, you had the first true World Championship, which was the CPL Winter Event 2001, the one famously where NIP and X3, the best European and best North American team, played in the final in an epic match. And that was actually the only official World Championship that we ever had in Counter-Strike 1.6, because that was actually endorsed by Valve and called a World Championship, as Heaton, funnily enough, often mentions as a kind of a jokey piece of trivia that, you know, he's still the reigning champion in that sense from CS 1.6. Other tournaments would come along and become majors, such as the other CPL Summer, CPL Winter events. World Cyber Games came along that year, but that year, 2001, because it clashed with the CPL Winter event, wasn't considered as big an event, but it became a major the following years. ESWC came along in 2003. Later on, you get to 2007. IEM establishes itself. By 2008, it has its own global event, its own World Championship, its own major. And this was the history of the majors in Counter-Strike. You can see how long long that game lasted. And it was always due to this grassroots component, that there were so many people interested that even when a bunch of people left and got bored with the game and didn't see esports as a long-term thing, you'd always have the turnover of new fans coming in, watching the new teams. The game developed in terms of evolution a lot. Things like ESEA came along, things like eSports Tournament kept people interested in it, had a way to suck them back in when they hadn't played for a while. They wanted to play with other friends of theirs that were watching tournaments that were still involved in the game. And while the industry may have embraced Counter-Strike and pivoted to feature it as its main game, it was not well received outside of the boundaries of the Counter-Strike community. People in games like Quake actually used to be very derogatory about Counter-Strike. Famous people like, you might know him, Carmack now, who works for ESL as one of their head people for the last half a decade or more. People like him, or we're closing in almost 10 years now, used to say stuff like that it was just camping behind boxes with an MP5 and it was a low-skilled game. It wasn't on the level of a Quake or Unreal, which I can agree with certain sentiments, but this was heavily pushed by the people in games like Quake, in games like Unreal, very high-skilled 1v1, fast-paced Twitch shooters. The feeling was Counter-Strike was for noobs, it was just for casuals, and it didn't have a lot of skill, and it was camping, and they didn't kind of see the tactical genius of the game, and they thought spraying and inaccuracy just increased randomness and had an RNG element. There's some elements to it, but there was a lot of pushback from the fans of the previous games. And so actually Counter-Strike was treated how in the modern day games like League of Legends have been treated by people in Counter-Strike. And now games like Fortnite and PUBG and others will be treated also, where they're just seen as casual games with no viability as an esports game. Now, some of the notable features that allowed Counter-Strike to rise in this way, from just fun game that became big as a community game and then eventually made the transition to esport. First of all, I always mention this, in a weird way, Counter-Strike was the first big esport that was free to play. Now, it wasn't explicitly, because to play Counter-Strike, which was a mod of Half-Life, you had to own Half-Life until the retail version of Counter-Strike came out in November 2000, where they had enough elements of Half-Life within the retail version that you could just play it as a standalone game. But the reason why that wasn't a problem, and the reason why it felt like Counter-Strike was a free-to-play game, is because Half-Life was like the game of the year in 1998. Everyone bought this game to play it single player. It was an amazing game, wasn't very good as a multiplayer game, fabulous single-player game, great storyline, Gordon Freeman, all the alien stuff, the sci-fi shit, allusions to the Men in Black and Area 51 and the X-Files, which was obviously one of the hype shows at the time. So since everyone already had it, it was such a fabulous game, and piracy wasn't as big back then for certain games. You had to have CD code, for example, to make a game like Half-Life work. I don't think it was patched for many years. And that meant since everyone had already bought Half-Life, now it was free for you to play Day of Defeat, Natural Selection, and Counter-Strike, because you already had Half-Life in the CD key. Therefore, you could just download Counter-Strike and play it. And therefore, people with early internet connections were downloading it. If you went to a LAN party, people would give you the patch. You'd put that on your computer. It wasn't long. I think it was maybe like Beta 5 that they started to include it on the old PC Gamer magazines, where they had a CD on the front, and you could use that instead of having to download it. You could get the game that way. So in that sense, in a way, it had the free-to-play component where people were able to just try this game because they already had Half-Life in most cases, and therefore you had a massive amount of people who could try it, and it could build this insane critical mass way before it could ever be marketed and sold officially, and in that traditional sense, built up as an esports game or a game in its own right. As I said, it forced its way in due to just sheer amount of people playing it. And so even though a game like Quake was better suited as a spectator experience and had the whole mechanism behind it and clans and a history and a prestige already in esports, Counter-Strike was just showing that they could give you the numbers. They could just explode the popularity of esports if you made this one of your main focal points. And there was just more people willing to attend events, play in events, more teams, more players overall. And so the industry naturally, for the sake of, obviously we'd had the .com bubble burst, just made the cynical, but in the end profitable and effective move to pivot over to Counter-Strike. It was also a scenario that, quite frankly, people were ripe for a new type of game. Quake was too hardcore game. Even Quake 3, which dumbed down a lot of hard elements and a lot of the more extreme components of playing a Quake game, was still way too hard for most people. Most people would quit. Most people didn't like being beaten up in the game. Instead, Counter-Strike, much more fun vibe, especially on public servers, especially where you have the money component, where you have a gun and he doesn't have a gun sometimes. So you have an advantage, even if you're a worse player. You shoot him in the head, he dies instantly. You can get a little bit lucky with that. Early on, people had bad mice. They had all ball mice. They had very small mouse pads. When you were playing with a Quake sensitivity, as most people did, you didn't have amazing aim. Therefore, people weren't getting mad headshots on each other all the way out of the gate every single time they met each other, and you had a lot more play. And as a result, it was a much more appealing game to casual people. And then, as a team game, it brought a very different dynamic. Sure, we'd had Quake Team Deathmatch, which in a game like Quake World became very advanced. But in Counter-Strike, this was actually a game where, because it was the tactical component, and you die, and you don't get respawned until the next round, and you have to watch your teammates, and then before you have the 5v5 battle, and you had all these different maps. Early on, you had CS maps, then you had the detonation maps, the bomb maps with the diffusal component. This brought a whole new type of play, a slower-paced type of play than Quake TDM, sure, but as a result, it appealed to a different kind of person, and therefore, it had its own unique charm to it. And to me, the tactical element is always what made Counter-Strike a vital and, in my opinion, an important game, because it had a different twist to Quake, even if Quake was more skilled in certain other respects. Then you've got to add in that, sure, it wasn't as easy to watch as Quake 1v1 because you've got more players and you've got the maps and the tactics. But compared to games like Warcraft or StarCraft or some of the other games that came along later, League of Legends, Dota, all these sorts of games, it's a pretty easy game to watch. But crucially, it's easy to watch, it's easy to learn the basics of, but it's very difficult to master, and there is a massive amount of depth there. And that is what not only allowed people to get in the door, so you get a lot of people through the initial bottleneck of how many people are going to play the game, but then you can get a lot of people to watch the game. It's not too tough to understand, but the ones that watch don't just then tune out because it's just too casual, and they got in the door and they enjoyed it initially, but then they get bored of it. There's a lot of depth there. They can master it. They can start to learn some of the layers of tactical depth, or what's going on skill-wise, and what aspects of technique there are. And then there's the sporting element of this team versus this team. What has Team A accomplished? What has Team B been able to do? How do they match up with Team C when they battle against them? What's the history of upcoming Team D or old legends in Team E? In these scenarios, you have the whole sports culture that now starts to follow. And once the tournaments pop up, then you have a real circuit and you have real narratives that pass from tournament to tournament. This team, Team A, won the tournament 4 months ago, but they've been off the boil. Team C's the team to beat right now, but Team B's their main rival. Will they meet in the final? You had this element to keep people involved. So as I've often alluded to, it in a sense, it foreshadowed games like League of Legends by the free-to-play component in this weird kind of catch sense that you had to have Half-Life, but we all did. So that's why a lot of people tried it and embraced it as a game, whereas they might not have been as interested in Quake. Then it had the poker quality that it's easy to learn, it's easy to get to grips with and watch, but then it's very deep and it can be mastered, and it has its own special charm that the other games don't cater to. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Daniel Yordanov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, and Travis Greb, with a special thanks going out to Jerky's Minion. Want teasers for my upcoming content? To ask a question for my monthly AMA? How about taking part in a discussion with me about esports? Or perhaps you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Become a part of the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.